The courtroom was silent, the air thick with anticipation. Every eye was fixed on the man sitting at the defense table. David John, the billionaire entrepreneur who had once been celebrated as a self-made success story. But today, he wasn't a hero. Today he was on trial for fraud, deceit, and the destruction of countless lives. His tailored suit and polished shoes screamed wealth, but his demeanor screamed something far worse: arrogance. David leaned back in his chair, his legs casually crossed as if he were lounging in a luxury hotel rather than a courtroom. He didn't stand when Judge Kristen Lee entered the room, a move that sent a ripple of gasps through the spectators. The bailiff shot him a stern look, but David merely smirked, his icy blue eyes scanning the room with disdain. He was a man who believed the rules didn't apply to him. Judge Lee, a woman in her late 50s with sharp features and an even sharper reputation, took her seat. Her gaze locked onto David, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. She didn't say a word, but her expression spoke volumes. This was her courtroom, and she would tolerate no disrespect. The prosecution began its opening statement, outlining the charges against David. He was accused of orchestrating a series of fraudulent investment schemes, preying on vulnerable families who trusted him with their life savings. The victims included Angela Vaughn, a single mother who had lost her home, and Emily Vaughn, her elderly mother who had invested her retirement fund in David's promises of financial security. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who had used his charm and wealth to manipulate and destroy. As the first witness was called, a middle-aged man named Robert, who had lost his entire savings, David's smirk never wavered. He scribbled notes on a legal pad, occasionally whispering to his high-priced attorney as if the proceedings were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. But when Robert began to describe how David had personally assured him that his investments were guaranteed, the billionaire's facade cracked for just a moment. His jaw tightened and his pen stopped moving. Judge Lee watched it all with a steely gaze. She had seen countless criminals in her courtroom, but there was something about David's arrogance that struck a nerve. She leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "Mr. John," she said, "this is your final warning. You will show respect in this courtroom, or you will be held in contempt." David tilted his head as if considering her words, but he didn't respond. Instead, he leaned over to his attorney and whispered something that made the lawyer's face pale. The tension in the room grew thicker. As the first section of the trial unfolded, the audience was left with burning questions. Why was David so confident? What was he hiding? And most importantly, what would Judge Lee do next to ensure justice was served? The stage was set for a battle of wills, and no one could predict how it would end. The courtroom was a stage, and one by one the victims stepped forward to share their stories. Each testimony was a dagger, piercing through the armor of David's arrogance. The first to take the stand was Angela Vaughn, a single mother in her early 30s. Her hands trembled as she clutched the microphone, but her voice was steady, filled with a quiet strength. "I trusted him," she began, her eyes fixed on David. "He came to our community center, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than my yearly salary. He told us he wanted to help people like me, hardworking families who just needed a little boost to achieve their dreams. He promised us returns that sounded too good to be true." And they were. Angela's voice broke as she described how she had invested her life savings, $50,000, into David's scheme. "It was everything I had," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I thought I was securing a future for my son. Instead, I lost it all. I lost my home. I had to move in with my mother, who had also invested her retirement fund. Because of him, we have nothing." David's smirk faltered for the first time. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding Angela's gaze, but Judge Lee was watching him closely, her expression unreadable. Next was Emily Vaughn, Angela's mother. A frail woman in her 70s, she walked slowly to the stand, leaning on a cane for support. Her voice was soft but filled with a quiet fury. "I worked my whole life," she said. "I saved every penny so I could retire with dignity. But he took it all. He looked me in the eye and told me my money was safe. He lied." The courtroom was silent as Emily described the toll the financial loss had taken on her health. "I can't sleep at night," she admitted. I lie awake, wondering how I'll pay for my medication, how I'll afford to keep a roof over our heads. He didn't just take my money, he took my peace of mind." As Emily stepped down, the weight of her words hung heavy in the air. The spectators exchanged glances, their anger palpable. Even the jurors, who had been instructed to remain impartial, couldn't hide their emotions. One juror wiped away a tear, while another clenched his fists. David, however, seemed determined to maintain his composure. He leaned over to his attorney and whispered, "This is all emotional manipulation. They're trying to make me look like a monster." His lawyer nodded but said nothing, his face tense. Judge Lee, meanwhile, was taking meticulous notes. Her sharp eyes darted between the witnesses and David as if piecing together a puzzle. When the prosecution called their next witness, a financial analyst who had uncovered the fraudulent nature of David's schemes, she listened intently, her expression growing darker with each revelation. The analyst, a young woman named Priya, explained how David's investment opportunities were nothing more than a Ponzi scheme. "He was using new investors' money to pay off old ones," she said. "It was unsustainable. Eventually, the whole thing collapsed, leaving thousands of people financially ruined." David's attorney objected, arguing that the analyst's testimony was speculative, but Judge Lee overruled him. "The witness is qualified to speak on this matter," she said firmly. "Continue." As Priya detailed the extent of David's deceit, the courtroom buzzed with murmurs of disbelief. How had he gotten away with it for so long? And why had no one stopped him sooner? The section ended with a bombshell revelation. Priya had discovered that David had been funneling millions of dollars into offshore accounts, effectively hiding his wealth from authorities. The prosecution promised to present evidence of this in the next phase of the trial. The audience was left on the edge of their seats. What would the evidence reveal? And how would David react when confronted with the full extent of his crimes? The stakes were higher than ever, and the tension in the courtroom was unbearable. As the prosecution rested its case, the spotlight shifted to David's defense team. His attorney, a slick and polished man named Gregory Hayes, stood up with an air of confidence that mirrored his client's. He adjusted his tie and approached the jury, his voice smooth and persuasive. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Gregory began, "what you've heard so far is a one-sided narrative designed to paint my client as a villain, but the truth is far more complicated. David John is a visionary, a man who took risks to create opportunities for others. Yes, some investments failed. That's the nature of business. But to call it fraud? That's a gross oversimplification." Gregory's strategy was clear. He aimed to humanize David, to make the jury see him as a misunderstood entrepreneur rather than a criminal. He called his first witness, a former employee of David's company, a young man named Ryan who had worked in the marketing department. Ryan testified that David had always been passionate about helping people. He genuinely believed in his projects, Ryan said. He wanted to create jobs, to build communities. I never saw him as someone who would intentionally deceive anyone. The defense also presented documents showing that David had donated millions to charity over the years. Gregory emphasized this point, arguing that a man capable of such generosity couldn't possibly be the heartless fraudster the prosecution had described. But the prosecution wasn't about to let the defense rewrite the narrative. During cross-examination, they grilled Ryan about the inner workings of David's company. "Did you ever question where the money for these so-called investments was coming from?" the prosecutor asked. Ryan hesitated. I trusted the financial team to handle that," he admitted. "And did you ever wonder why so many people lost their life savings while Mr. John continued to live in luxury?" Ryan's face flushed. I didn't know the details." The prosecution's point was clear. David's employees had been kept in the dark, just like his victims. Next, the defense called a character witness, a wealthy socialite named Vanessa, who had known David for years. She described him as a generous and kind-hearted man who had always been misunderstood. "People are quick to judge him because of his success," she said, "but he's not the monster they're making him out to be." Again, the prosecution countered with a sharp cross-examination. "Ms. Vanessa," the prosecutor began, "are you aware that Mr. John is accused of defrauding thousands of people out of their life savings?" Vanessa shifted uncomfortably. I've heard the allegations, but I don't believe them. And do you think the victims who testified earlier are lying? Vanessa hesitated, her confidence wavering. I don't know. The defense's attempts to paint David in a positive light were faltering, but Gregory wasn't done yet. He saved his most dramatic move for last. He called David himself to the stand. David stood up, his posture confident, his expression calm. He took the oath and sat down, facing the jury with the same charm that had once convinced so many to trust him. Gregory began with soft questions, allowing David to tell his story in his own words. "I've always been a dreamer," David said, his voice smooth and persuasive. "I wanted to create something that would change lives. Yes, there were risks, but I believed in what I was doing. I never intended to hurt anyone." Gregory nodded sympathetically. "And what about the allegations of fraud? How do you respond to those?" David's face hardened. "They're baseless," he said firmly. "I made mistakes, but I never set out to deceive anyone. I'm being targeted because of my success, because people are jealous of what I've achieved." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Was David truly a victim of jealousy, as he claimed? Or was this just another attempt to manipulate the narrative? As the defense rested its case, the tension in the room was palpable. The jury now had two conflicting stories to consider. One of a greedy fraudster who preyed on the vulnerable, and another of a misunderstood visionary who had been unfairly targeted. But the real question remained. Which story would they believe? The prosecution wasn't about to let David's narrative stand unchallenged. As soon as the defense rested its case, the lead prosecutor, a sharp and determined woman named Clara Martinez, stood up. Her eyes burned with intensity as she addressed the judge. "Your Honor, the defense has attempted to paint Mr. John as a misunderstood visionary, but the evidence tells a different story. We request permission to present rebuttal witnesses and additional evidence to expose the truth." Judge Lee nodded. "Permission granted. Proceed, Ms. Martinez." Clara didn't waste a second. She called her first rebuttal witness, a forensic accountant named Marcus who had spent months unraveling David's financial web. Marcus took the stand, his demeanor calm and professional, but his words were explosive. "Mr. John's offshore accounts tell a story of deliberate deceit," Marcus began. "He funneled over $200 million into shell companies in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. These funds were not used for legitimate business purposes. They were hidden away, far from the reach of authorities and creditors." Marcus presented detailed charts and documents, showing how David had systematically siphoned money from his investors. "He wasn't just making mistakes," Marcus said. "He was orchestrating a sophisticated scheme to enrich himself at the expense of others." David's attorney objected, arguing that the evidence was speculative, but Judge Lee overruled him. "The witness is qualified and the evidence is relevant," she said firmly. "Continue, Mr. Marcus." Marcus went on to explain how David had used fake financial statements to lure in new investors. "He created the illusion of profitability," Marcus said, "but in reality the numbers were fabricated. He was running a classic Ponzi scheme." The courtroom was silent as Marcus's testimony sank in. Even the jurors, who had been instructed to remain impartial, couldn't hide their shock. One juror shook her head in disbelief, while another clenched his jaw, clearly angered by what he was hearing. Clara then called her next witness, a former business partner of David's named Lucas. Lucas had worked closely with David in the early days of his career, and his testimony was damning. "David always had a knack for manipulation," Lucas said. "He knew how to sell a dream, how to make people believe in him, but behind the scenes he was ruthless. He didn't care who got hurt, as long as he came out on top." Lucas described how David had pressured him to falsify documents and mislead investors. "I refused," Lucas said, "and that's when he cut me out. He surrounded himself with people who would do whatever he asked, no questions asked." David's attorney tried to discredit Lucas, suggesting that he was bitter and seeking revenge. But Lucas held his ground. "I'm not bitter," he said. "I'm here because I want the truth to come out. People need to know what he's capable of." The prosecution's final rebuttal witness was perhaps the most shocking of all, a whistleblower from David's company named Sarah. She had worked in the finance department and had access to sensitive information. Sarah's testimony was explosive. "I saw everything," she said. The fake accounts, the forged documents, the lies. I tried to speak up, but I was threatened. David told me that if I ever went public, he would ruin me. Sarah's voice trembled as she described the toll the experience had taken on her. I lost my job, my reputation, everything. But I couldn't stay silent anymore. These people deserve justice. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as Sarah stepped down. The prosecution had delivered a devastating blow to David's defense, exposing the depth of his deceit and the lengths he had gone to cover his tracks. As Clara rested her case, she turned to the jury and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence is clear. David John is not a misunderstood visionary. He is a fraudster who preyed on the vulnerable for his own gain. It's time to hold him accountable." The tension in the room was unbearable. The jury now had a mountain of evidence to consider, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Would they see through David's lies and deliver justice for the victims? Or would his wealth and charm be enough to sway them? The courtroom was packed to capacity as the trial entered its final phase. Spectators leaned forward in their seats, eager to hear the closing arguments that would determine David John's fate. The air was thick with tension, and even the usually stoic Judge Lee seemed to sit a little straighter, her sharp eyes scanning the room. The prosecution went first. Clara Martinez stood up, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. She walked slowly to the jury box, her heels clicking against the polished floor, and paused for a moment, letting the silence build. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice steady and strong, "this case is not just about numbers or financial transactions. It's about trust. It's about the lives that were shattered because one man chose greed over integrity." Clara's words were deliberate, each one carrying the weight of the evidence she had presented. She recounted the testimonies of Angela and Emily Vaughn, the forensic accountant's findings, and the whistleblower's revelations. "David John didn't make mistakes," she said. "He made choices. Choices to lie, to deceive, and to destroy. He took advantage of people who trusted him, people who believed in his promises. And for what? To fund his lavish lifestyle? To hide his wealth in offshore accounts?" She paused, letting her words sink in. "This man," she continued, pointing at David, "believes he's above the law. He believes his wealth and privilege can shield him from accountability. But you have the power to prove him wrong. You have the power to show that no one is above the law, not even a billionaire." Clara's closing argument was a masterclass in persuasion. She appealed not just to the jury's sense of justice, but to their humanity. "Think about Angela and Emily," she said. "Think about all the victims who lost everything because of David John's greed. They trusted him and he betrayed them. Don't let him betray the justice system too." When Clara finished, the courtroom was silent. Even David, who had maintained his smug demeanor throughout much of the trial, seemed to shrink slightly in his seat. The jury's faces were unreadable, but their eyes were fixed on Clara, absorbing every word. Next, it was the defense's turn. Gregory Hayes stood up, his polished demeanor intact, but there was a hint of tension in his posture. He approached the jury with the same confidence he had shown earlier, but the weight of the prosecution's case was clearly on his mind. "Ladies and gentlemen," Gregory began, "the prosecution would have you believe that David John is a monster. But let me remind you, this is a man who has dedicated his life to creating opportunities for others. Yes, there were failures. Yes, people lost money. But that doesn't make him a criminal. It makes him human." Gregory's strategy was to sow doubt. He emphasized the complexity of the financial world, suggesting that David's actions were simply the result of bad business decisions, not criminal intent. "The prosecution has presented a compelling story," he said. "But a story is not evidence. Where is the smoking gun? Where is the proof that David John intentionally set out to defraud anyone?" He pointed to the character witnesses who had testified on David's behalf, reminding the jury of their glowing descriptions of him. "This is a man who has given millions to charity, who has helped countless people. Does that sound like a fraudster to you?" Gregory's closing argument was slick and well-rehearsed, but it lacked the emotional punch of Clara's. He ended with a plea for fairness. "Don't let anger or sympathy cloud your judgment," he said. David John is innocent until proven guilty, and the prosecution has not met that burden of proof. As Gregory returned to his seat, the courtroom buzzed with murmurs. The jury now had two starkly different narratives to consider. Would they side with the prosecution, convinced by the mountain of evidence and the emotional testimonies of the victims? Or would they accept the defense's argument that David was simply a flawed but innocent man? Judge Lee's voice cut through the noise. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said, "it is now your duty to deliberate and reach a verdict. Take your time. Consider the evidence carefully. And remember, the burden of proof lies with the prosecution." The jury filed out of the courtroom, leaving everyone else in suspense. The tension was almost unbearable. What would they decide? And how would David react when the verdict was finally announced? The hours dragged on as the jury deliberated. The courtroom, once filled with tension, now felt like a pressure cooker ready to explode. Spectators whispered among themselves, speculating about the outcome. Reporters hovered near the doors, ready to break the news the moment a verdict was reached. David John sat at the defense table, his arrogance replaced by a rare stillness. Even his attorney, Gregory Hayes, seemed on edge, his polished demeanor cracking under the weight of anticipation. Judge Kristen Lee remained the picture of composure, her sharp eyes occasionally glancing at the clock. She knew the importance of this case, not just for the victims, but for the justice system itself. This was a trial that would be remembered, and she was determined to ensure it was handled with the utmost integrity. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom erupted into a flurry of activity as everyone rushed to their seats. David straightened his tie, his face unreadable, while Clara Martinez exchanged a tense glance with her team. The victims, Angela, Emily, and others, sat together, their hands clasped tightly, their faces a mix of hope and fear. The jury filed in, their expressions giving nothing away. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, stood up and handed a piece of paper to the bailiff, who passed it to Judge Lee. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Judge Lee scanned the paper, her face impassive, and then handed it back to the bailiff. "Will the defendant please rise?" she said, her voice cutting through the silence. David stood up, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the jury. Gregory Hayes stood beside him, his hand resting on the back of David's chair in a gesture of support. The bailiff unfolded the paper and read aloud. "On the count of fraud in the first degree, we the jury find the defendant, David John, guilty." Gasps filled the room. Angela and Emily hugged each other, tears streaming down their faces. Other victims broke into quiet sobs, their relief palpable. Clara Martinez allowed herself a small, satisfied smile, while her team exchanged quiet congratulations. The bailiff continued, reading the verdicts for each of the remaining counts. On the count of conspiracy to commit fraud as guilty. On the count of money laundering, guilty. On the count of obstruction of justice, guilty. With each guilty, David's composure cracked a little more. By the time the bailiff finished, his face was pale, his hands trembling slightly. He turned to Gregory, his voice a low, desperate whisper. "This can't be happening. Do something." Gregory shook his head, his expression grim. "There's nothing more we can do right now," he said quietly. "We'll appeal. But for now, it's over." Judge Lee banged her gavel, silencing the murmurs in the room. "Order," she said firmly. She turned to David, her gaze piercing. "Mr. John, you have been found guilty on all counts. Sentencing will take place in 2 weeks. Until then, you will be remanded into custody." The bailiff stepped forward, handcuffs in hand. David's eyes widened in disbelief as the cold metal closed around his wrists. "This is a mistake," he said, his voice rising. "I'm innocent. You can't do this to me." But no one was listening. The bailiff led him away, his protests echoing through the courtroom until the doors closed behind him. The room erupted into chatter as reporters rushed to file their stories and spectators exchanged shocked reactions. For the victims, it was a moment of vindication. Angela stood up, her voice trembling but filled with determination. "This isn't just about us," she said, addressing the room. "This is about holding people accountable, no matter how powerful they are. Today, justice was served." Judge Lee watched the scene unfold, her expression thoughtful. She knew this case would have far-reaching implications, sending a message to others who might think they could manipulate the system. But for now, her focus was on ensuring that the sentencing phase was handled with the same care and precision as the trial. As the courtroom emptied, the weight of what had just happened settled over everyone. David John, the arrogant billionaire who had once believed he was untouchable, was now a convicted felon. The question on everyone's mind was, what would his sentence be? And how would he react when faced with the full consequences of his actions? 2 weeks later, the courtroom was once again filled to capacity. This time, the atmosphere was different, less tense, more somber. The verdict had been delivered, and now it was time for Judge Kristen Lee to pronounce the sentence. David John, dressed in a plain suit instead of his usual tailored attire, sat at the defense table, his arrogance replaced by a hollowed-out weariness. The handcuffs around his wrists were a stark reminder of his fall from grace. The victims, Angela, Emily, and others sat together in the front row, their faces a mix of relief and lingering pain. They had waited a long time for this moment, and now that it was here, it felt both cathartic and bittersweet. Judge Lee entered the courtroom, her presence commanding immediate silence. She took her seat and adjusted her glasses, her expression unreadable. "This court is now in session," she said, her voice steady. "We are here today to deliver the sentence in the case of the state versus David John." She turned to David, her gaze piercing. "Mr. John, you have been found guilty on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. These crimes were not the result of a single mistake or a momentary lapse in judgment. They were part of a deliberate, calculated scheme to enrich yourself at the expense of others. You preyed on the vulnerable, exploited their trust, and left countless lives in ruins." David opened his mouth as if to protest, but Judge Lee raised a hand, silencing him. "You have shown no remorse for your actions. Even now you seem more concerned with your own fate than with the lives you've destroyed. That arrogance, that belief that you are above the law, is what makes this case so egregious." She paused, letting her words sink in. "It is the duty of this court to ensure that justice is served, not just for the victims, but for society as a whole. Your actions have undermined the public's trust in the financial system and in the rule of law. A lenient sentence would send the wrong message, that wealth and privilege can shield someone from accountability." Judge Lee straightened her papers and looked directly at David. "For these reasons, I sentence you to 25 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole. You will also be required to pay restitution to your victims in the amount of $150 million. Failure to comply with this order will result in additional penalties." The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. 25 years was a harsh sentence, far longer than many had expected. David's face went pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if to steady himself. His attorney, Gregory Hayes, leaned over to whisper something to him, but David didn't seem to hear. He stared straight ahead, his expression blank, as if the reality of his situation was finally sinking in. Judge Lee banged her gavel. "This court is adjourned." As the bailiff led David away, the victims exchanged tearful hugs and quiet words of relief. Angela turned to her mother, Emily, and squeezed her hand. "It's over," she said softly. "We can finally start to move on." But for David, it was just the beginning. As he was escorted out of the courtroom, the weight of his sentence settled over him like a heavy shroud. The man who had once believed he was untouchable was now facing the prospect of spending the next 2.5 decades behind bars. His wealth, his privilege, his charm, none of it could save him now. In the weeks that followed, the case made headlines around the world. David John became a symbol of corporate greed and the dangers of unchecked ambition. His downfall served as a cautionary tale, a reminder that no one is above the law. For the victims, life slowly began to return to normal. The restitution payments provided some financial relief, but the emotional scars remained. Angela and Emily used their experience to advocate for stronger regulations to protect investors, ensuring that others wouldn't suffer the same fate. As for Judge Kristen Lee, she returned to her duties with the same dedication and integrity that had defined her career. The case had been one of the most challenging of her life, but it had also been one of the most rewarding. Justice had been served, and that was all that mattered. The story of David John, the arrogant billionaire who refused to stand for the judge, ended not with a triumphant victory, but with a harsh reckoning. It was a story of greed, deceit, and the enduring power of justice. And it was a story that would not soon be forgotten.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.